Hi there everyone, welcome to this week's video where we're going to talk about Pierre Bayle and the problem of evil, specifically the problem of evil for the Christian religion. At this point, Pierre Bayle has come up a couple of times over the course of our semester. He's a historian, and that's at least how he characterizes himself, but he quite often gets himself into really thorny and tricky philosophical problems. While Pierre Bayle is not very well known outside of specialists of early modern philosophy nowadays, he was enormously popular and influential during the time that he wrote. His sort of magnum opus, his really big book that sort of defined his career, was the Historical Critical Dictionary. This dictionary offered historical reconstruction of the views of especially a lot of ancient cults, while also providing commentary from Bayle's own perspective about the feasibility or lack thereof of these views. So the Historical Critical Dictionary is really interesting in a way, just how indirect it is, right? The chapter that we're reading today is about the Manichaeans, who are this ancient cult who believed that there were two warring divine forces in the world, good and evil. Now, for us, it's kind of hard to imagine how somebody's commentary on the Manichaeans is going to turn out to be one of the most influential works for the 18th century, the period of the Enlightenment, right? But Bayle ultimately brings out a really deep and central problem for Christian theology, namely what is known as the problem of evil. And the problem of evil is going to be Bayle's central mechanism for arguing for the equality of Christian and Manichaean views of the world, right? So, in essence, the Manichaean chapter is set up to offer a constant comparison between the central commitments of monotheism. Bayle here has in mind especially Christianity, but I believe that in principle his objections and arguments will apply to all forms of monotheism, right? And in contrast to the view of the Manichaeans, right? Ultimately, the monotheists want to say that there is one central fundamental force in the universe, right? That being God. And the Manichaeans are going to argue that the world and appearances are a product of two warring forces, right? Two forces that conflict, that push against one another, namely good and evil. So essentially the question comes down to this: should we think about evil as somehow coming from an absolutely perfect God, as in the monotheistic tradition, or should we think about evil as existing somehow outside of the nature of God, right? That's the view that the Manichaeans adopt. Now, it's interesting because Bayle is not going to argue straightforwardly that the Christian view is wrong, right? In fact, he says that there's a lot of arguments given by the philosophical tradition that we've been reading that are in favor of monotheism. He cites in particular the importance of the ontological argument, as we've talked about in the past, as demonstrating through purely rational a priori means that there must be one single, absolutely perfect God. And it's important to take a moment here to pause and notice that it's almost like, according to the Enlightenment, reason itself necessarily terminates in monotheism. To get a sense for why this is the case, think about paganism, right? Pagan traditions think that there are these gods that govern individual regions or parts of the world, right? So, perhaps Ares, for example, is the god of war, and Apollo is, god of the sun, or what have you, right? And each of these gods governs one aspect or region of the world, right? Well, we can say that it is the nature of reason to attempt to explain many things in virtue of one thing. So, for example, rather than having individual accounts of why each individual thing falls, right, we develop a theory of gravitation that can explain all of these instances of ordinary objects falling, right? And so monotheism is, in a way, the natural result of the progression of reason, right? So rather than trying to explain all of the warlike phenomena by appeal to Ares and all of the wisdom phenomena by appeal to Athena, we instead take the world in total and we seek to provide an explanation for the world in total, the cause of the entire natural world. And boom, once you have that idea, you're basically into monotheistic religious traditions, right? So on a purely a priori level, monotheism is much more appealing than Manichaeanism, right? There's really nothing like the ontological argument or anything like that that can speak in favor of there being two fundamental forces in the universe, right? The same impetus that would cause you to reduce it to two, right, should furthermore cause you to reduce it to one. Right? So Manichaeanism on an a priori level seems like a really incoherent doctrine. It seems like it really has nothing going for it. There's no reason for why anyone would adopt this view. Now here's where the interesting part of Bayle's assessment enters. It enters because he says, okay, that can all be true. It can be entirely the case that Christianity has all of these a priori arguments on its side, and we believe in all of those a priori arguments, but it's still not in better rational standing than Manichaeanism. Why? Well, because monotheism, it appears incoherent from an a posteriori standpoint. In other words, nothing about monotheism is consistent with or can explain the world as I encounter it within experience. Right? By contrast, if the Manichaean view is right, then I can explain the nature of experience, in particular, why it is that there's evil in the world. Now, Bayle writes very, very interestingly about evil. Bayle says, for example, that you can know evil just by introspecting. If you just know yourself, then you will understand that there's an impetus to evil in your soul. And moreover, he's a historian, and he thinks that historians have special knowledge of how evil and frivolous and purposeless a lot of the suffering in human history has been, right? It doesn't serve any broad moral purpose. There's evil that is never rectified. There's evil that comes to adopt political power. Evil is undoubtedly a force within the world that is historically relevant, right? So what is Bayle's argument for the superiority of Manichaeanism on an a posteriori level? Well, if Manichaeanism is true, then we can at least explain why there's evil, right? Evil, in a way, makes sense as the product of this tension or conflict between two forces, that there are different degrees of evil within the world. And if the world were like the monotheistic traditions say, then why is the world so different from the nature of God, right? Why is there gratuitous, needless suffering in the world if God himself is completely perfect, right? Absolutely perfect on Descartes' conception, which means that it fulfills all of those omni words. Omnipotent, God can do everything. Omniscient, God knows everything. And omnibenevolent, God has love for everything. If all of those characteristics which define monotheism are true, then it seems, Bayle argues, that we should expect the world also to be perfect. In other words, we should expect the world to reflect the power of God as its creator, right? The effect should, in that way, resemble at least the cause. So let's pause for a moment to get a better sense of why the problem of evil is such a big problem for monotheism and especially Christianity. And for this, we can refer to the Epicurean tetralemma. Some of the literature calls this a trilemma, but it's clearly not a trilemma. There's 4 options given. Tetra means 4, right? So I'm just going to refer to it as the Epicurean tetralemma. Now, importantly, Epicurus probably didn't write this. It's not in any extant historical material by him, and Epicurean becomes the word epikuros, which just means heretic, right? So this is just sort of like an atheist saying. And because it's an atheist saying, it's attributed to Epicurus, who's supposed to be like, the arch heretic, as it were, right? So anyway, here is the tetralemma. And essentially what the tetralemma wants to demonstrate is that the continued existence of evil is incompatible with the monotheistic understanding of God. So tetralemma means that there are 4 options. You can know that there are 4 options because they're all about the willingness and the ability of God to stop evil, right? So he just runs through all 4 of the possibilities by taking those 2 terms against each other. So let's start out with number 1. Is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not genuinely omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Well, then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence comes evil? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God, right? And so, in other words, this tetralemma tries to go through all of the permutations of God being able and willing to prevent evil and shows that all of these possibilities are incompatible with the continued existence of evil. And so while the Christian always has the upper hand on the Manichaean, when it comes to a priori rational explanations, the Manichaeans, on the contrary, always have the upper hand in their own assessment of human history and the explanatory power of their hypothesis. And Bayle proposes that rational explanations require both of these features. They require a priori plausibility and a posteriori explanatory value. Before moving on, let's just discuss a couple of common Christian counterarguments and why Bayle does not accept them. Sometimes Christians argue that evil needs to exist as a kind of moral lesson for human beings. Bayle's response to this is, well, number 1, it's not clear that all suffering has a moral lesson component to it, right? Some suffering is completely needless and gratuitous, and no one learns anything from it, right? But also, it still raises this question about God's omnipotence. In other words, we can communicate with each other without inflicting enormous amounts of suffering on each other, right? So why can't God at least manage to do the same thing? Others will argue, for example, that God can't have simply gotten rid of evil, right? That evil necessarily exists in any possible world that God can create. In other words, evil is necessary in any possible world. Bale's response to this is, hey, you're not actually a Christian, you're actually a Manichaean, right? If you believe genuinely in God and the devil, then you are not a real monotheist, according to Bale, right? In other words, you are smuggling in this sort of pagan way of understanding the Christian religion, right? Whereas if you had an actual rational understanding of Christianity, you would understand why it is that Christianity is a monotheistic religion. And so genuinely rational forms of explanation require this this kind of a priori plausibility and a posteriori explanatory value, but neither monotheism nor Manichaeanism is able to fully satisfy that. As you can imagine, saying all of this caught Bale in some pretty hot water. He was accused of being an atheist and of promoting atheistic beliefs. I mean, he just argued that Christianity is not rationally superior to old non-Christian minority religious traditions, right? And so one way to interpret Bale's argument is that he's a secret Epicurean, right? That he, is sort of riding behind this veneer of describing the views of the Manichaeans, whereas really he is propagating his own view. That's one way to interpret Bale. Another way to interpret Bale is to take him at his words. Bale argued that actually, even though it seems like the argument that he's proposed here is somehow incompatible with Christianity or undermines Christianity, really all it undermines is an Enlightenment interpretation of Christianity. And so Bale concludes with a kind of Christian skepticism. He argues that the Bible enjoins faith, not reason. In other words, the error is not with Christianity for failing to be fully rationally satisfactory. The error is with the Enlightenment philosopher who believes that religious truths need to be made rationally satisfactory to him in order for those truths to be valuable or important or worth believing. So Bale wants to argue, no, in fact, I'm the greatest defender of the Christian religion because I'm defending the Christian religion against its sort of gradual destruction by the Enlightenment that seeks to offer a rational explanation for everything and provide these towering a priori systems that can explain the nature of God. Instead, the only book that you should look to explain the nature of God is the Bible. Now, do you believe that Bale is a secret Epicurean, or do you take him at his word that he's a Christian skeptic? I'm really interested to hear what you think, and I will see you in the next video where we will discuss Leibniz's theodicy.